mail-order bride, rejected for her red hair, until a rancher said she burned brighter than the sun. As soon as she set foot on the ground, a child burst into tears, another slipped and was hurt, and an old man shouted, "The devil has arrived!" The stagecoach wheezed to a halt in a coughing cloud of red dust, the kind that clung to your boots and didn't let go. Eliza Byrne pressed a gloved hand to the window pane, squinting through the swirl as the sun dipped low behind the jagged mesas. After 3 grueling weeks, her journey was done. Painted Mesa, Arizona territory. A place that sounded beautiful in ink, but now looked more like a dried-out wound under a cruel ski day. She clutched the letter in her lap, a paper worn thin at the edges, stained by sweat and hope. Mr. Dryden Talcott, merchant and devout churchman, seeks a wife of refined breeding for companionship and moral partnership. Eliza had answered that ad with trembling hands and borrowed postage. Now she wasn't trembling. She was shivering. Not from fear exactly. From knowing there was no going back. The driver swung open the door. "End of the line, miss." Eliza stepped down onto cracked earth, the heel of her boot sinking slightly into the dust. Her satchel thumped beside her. She straightened her spine, brushed travel dirt from her dark green skirt, and lifted her chin. The light caught her hair, which had escaped its modest bun, strands of copper and flame, dancing in the golden hour sun. The effect was immediate. A child across the street began to scream. Another burst into tears, hiding behind his mother's skirts. A third tripped and fell hard on the edge of the boardwalk, howling in pain. The town square fell into an eerie hush. Then came the voice, thin and reedy, from an old woman wrapped in black lace. "The witch has come. The devil's bride walks among us." Eliza froze, heat prickling her skin like fire ants. She hadn't even spoken. A door slammed. Someone crossed themselves. A dog whimpered and backed away. The hotel clerk, who had been leaning on the rail smoking a pipe, nearly dropped it, muttering something under his breath before vanishing inside. And then she saw him. Dryden Talcott. He stepped out from the general store, dressed in pressed gray wool despite the heat, a man built like a ledger book, narrow, rigid, and lined in black ink. He approached with a stiff gait, eyes already narrowed on her, as if bracing for disappointment. "Miss Byrne," he said, glancing around at the gathering crowd. His voice was low, sharp as paper. "You didn't mention your appearance." Eliza's voice caught. "I didn't think it relevant." "Relevant," he snapped. "My dear, your hair, I know," she said softly. "It's red. Red, it's not just red. It's unnatural. Like it's on fire." He stepped back as if scorched. "They're already calling you a witch." She wanted to laugh, but her throat was too tight. "That's superstition, Mr. Talcott. That's reality, Miss Byrne," he said coldly. "This town is God-fearing, and I will not be marrying a woman who invites demons to my doorstep with every gust of wind." He turned on his heel. "The next eastbound stage is in 4 days. I suggest you be on it." And just like that, he was gone. Eliza stood alone on the dusty street of a town that had already decided she was cursed. A gust of desert wind lifted her hair again, and for a moment, it really did look like fire. She didn't cry. Not yet. But she did wonder, as the sun bled into the mesas behind her, if she had made the worst mistake of her life, or if this place, for all its hostility, had simply shown her the truth faster than most. Eliza stood rooted in place long after Talcott's boots had vanished behind the mercantile's swinging doors. Dust curled in lazy spirals around her trunk, the only companion she had left in this godforsaken town. She didn't know whether it was the sting of rejection or the collective hush of judgment that made her cheeks flame hotter than the Arizona sun. Either way, she couldn't move, not when whispers buzzed around her like horseflies. "That's the one, the red-haired girl from the swamp letter. Heard she reads fortunes. herd she heck his cattle. Eliza lowered her head, pulling her bonnet tighter over the blaze of her hair. She bent to retrieve her trunk, but the handle snapped off with a crack like a gunshot. Her valise tumbled open, spilling its modest contents into the dust. 3 dresses, a pair of worn gloves, a Bible with pages dog-eared by grief. No one stepped forward to help. No one but a woman's voice, smooth and warm as molasses. Lord, they didn't even let you breathe before tearing you down. Eliza looked up to find a young woman in a violet blouse and well-worn riding skirt, her honey blonde hair tucked into a tidy braid. She crouched beside Eliza and began gathering her things without waiting for permission. Eliza Byrne, the woman asked gently. Yes, Eliza managed. Her throat felt parched. I'm Clara. Clara Reed. I rent rooms upstairs at the hotel. Come on, you don't need to stand out here being picked apart like a buzzard's breakfast dayfist. Too shocked to argue, Eliza let Clara loop an arm through hers and guide her across the street. The hotel loomed like a weary relic of better times, its porch sagging windows smudged with dust and time. Inside, the air was thick with cigar smoke and the stale tang of whiskey, but it was quiet. A reprieve. Clara led her up a narrow flight of stairs to a small room with a narrow bed, a cracked wash basin and curtains that fluttered like ghost fingers. It's not much, Clara said, setting the trunk down with care, but the sheets are clean and the door locks. Eliza blinked, unsure how to respond to such unprompted kindness. Thank you. I don't know how to repay you. Clara waved her off. Nonsense, just breathe for now. You look like you ain't done that in a while. Eliza tried, but the breath that came was ragged, full of swallowed pain. She sat on the bed as Clara poured water into the basin. The mirror above it showed a face Eliza barely recognized, smeared with dust and disappointment, eyes wide with silent hurt. Her hair had escaped again, catching the dying light through the window like wildfire. I suppose I've ruined everything, she whispered. Clara paused, drying her hands slowly. You didn't ruin anything. Talcott's the one who invited you here, and then dropped you like a hot coal. That man's colder than a banker's handshake. Never liked him much. Eliza looked over. Clara's tone was still sweet, but something flickered behind her eyes, a quick gleam like sunlight on broken ice. Still, Clara added, her voice light again. Folks in Painted Mesa don't forget first impressions. You'll need to be careful, Eliza. This town's got a long memory and not much mercy. Eliza swallowed hard. She'd come west for a new beginning. Instead, she'd stepped into a fire she hadn't yet learned how to put out. By the 3rd day, Eliza learned how silence could cut sharper than a blade. Everywhere she walked, it followed her like a stray dog, tight-lipped glances, shifting shoulders, doors closing just fast enough to let her feel the slam. She didn't try to speak much anymore. There was no one willing to listen, and words she found had become brittle in her mouth. She moved quietly through Painted Mesa's sunburned streets, the hem of her dress brushing dust and disdain in equal measure. At the post office, the clerk refused to meet her eyes. At the market, the butcher turned his back and muttered prayers. Even the children stopped playing when she passed, clutching sticks and stones in clenched fists. It was like she'd stepped into a story they'd already told themselves, the red-haired witch, the cursed bride, the omen walking upright. Clara had warned her gently a day earlier over stale coffee and yesterday's biscuits. They don't need proof, Eliza. Just a reason to be afraid. She hadn't understood the full weight of that truth until the boys came. It was late afternoon. The heat lay thick across the town, curling up from the boards and walls like steam from a kettle. Eliza had stepped out to fetch water from the pump near the church when she heard the shuffle of boots behind her. 3 of them, barely older than boys, but their shoulders were hard with cruelty, faces twisted into sneers that didn't come from age, but from being told they were righteous. Devil's bride, one of them hissed. Heard you brought the fire. I didn't. She began backing toward the pump. She speaks lies, said another. Pastor Ellison says she walks with spirits. That house that burned down, you lit it. With your eyes. I wasn't even there, Eliza whispered. Don't matter, the third boy said. He stepped closer, stick in hand like a club. Fire don't care about truth. The first one grabbed her shoulder, hard. And then he was on the ground. It happened so fast Eliza barely registered the blur of motion before the boy landed in a puff of dust, groaning, his wrist twisted wrong. Standing over him was a man she hadn't seen before, broad-shouldered, sun-scarred, his hat pulled low, over sharp eyes the color of storm clouds. He held no gun, no badge, but something in his stance made the other two boys freeze like 3 bits before a hawk. You boys feel brave picking on a woman, he said, voice low, and graveled like gravel under wagon wheels. The boys stumbled back. She's cursed, pastor says. I don't give a damn what your pastor says. His gaze narrowed. If I see you touch her again, you'll wish you were dealing with hellfire. The boys ran out. Eliza stared, chest-heaving, hands trembling where they clutched the pump. Her knees gave slightly, but she caught herself. The stranger turned to her, removing his hat, slowly. You all right, ma'am? Eliza nodded, though it wasn't quite true. I'm Clayton Hart, he said after a beat. Got a place out west near the edge of the mesa. It's quiet, and no one talks much. If you need somewhere to catch your breath, I reckon it's yours. She didn't answer right away. But in that moment, with the sun flaring gold behind him and the town still burning holes in her back, it felt like the first true offer she'd been given. So she nodded again and walked away from the town that had named her witch toward a stranger with smoke in his eyes. The ride to Clayton Hart's ranch was quiet, save for the rhythmic clop of hooves and the occasional rustle of dry wind weaving through the mesquite. Eliza sat stiffly in the buckboard seat, her hands folded in her lap, gripping each other like they might float away if she let go. She didn't ask questions. He didn't offer much. But she could feel him glance at her now and then, like a man reading something written in a language he hadn't seen in years. The sun lowered behind the distant red cliffs, casting long shadows across the mesa. The land stretched wide, sunny and gold-tinted like a canvas waiting for a story to be painted on it. You're not from the territories, Clayton said, finally, his voice calm, unhurried. Eliza looked sideways. No. I'm from the Shenandoah Valley, Virginia. That's so. He nodded the way men do when they're trying to fit a new piece into an old puzzle. Violence again. Then softer. I served with men from that valley. In the war. Her heart gave a faint thump. My father did too, she said. What was his name? James Byrne. Clayton stopped the wagon. It wasn't dramatic. No gasp, no flinch. Just the reins going still in his calloused hands, and a moment of silence so deep it seemed the desert held its breath too. I knew James Byrne, he said at last. Knew him well. He saved my life. At Cold Harbor. Pulled me from the mud when half my chest was gone. Thought I was done for. Eliza swallowed. He never made it home. I know, Clayton said quietly. He bled out not long after. I buried him myself. The world tilted slightly. Eliza looked away, not trusting her voice. It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it, like he'd carried that moment folded in his pocket for years, worn soft from remembering. There was grief in it, yes. But also respect. Maybe even something like guilt. That's why you helped me, she whispered. Clayton didn't answer right away. Could be, he said. Could also be I don't like men laying hands on women in the name of superstition. Eliza managed a breath that was almost a laugh. She looked at him again. In the golden light, his face seemed carved from the mesa itself, lined quiet, but far from cold. There was something familiar in the way he looked at her. Not the way Talcott had, measuring, weighing. No. Clayton looked like he was remembering someone he'd once trusted. Someone long gone. "Your father talked about you," he added almost as an afterthought. "Said you had a streak of fire in you, even as a child." Eliza blinked back, tears brushing at her cheek. "I thought coming here would be a new chapter. I didn't expect to step into one that had already been written." Clayton nodded again, thoughtful. "Then, did Talcott know who you were?" "I never told him my father's name," she replied. "But he kept asking strange questions, about letters, about inheritance. And once he asked if my father had kept anything locked away." Clayton's gaze sharpened. "Like a safe?" She hesitated, then nodded. "He used to keep a strong box. He called it his quiet fortune. Said he buried it when he went off to war." Clayton didn't speak again, but his jaw tightened slightly. The wagon rolled on the sun, now slipping behind the mesa's crown. Eliza sat back, unsure whether she had just escaped one danger or ridden straight into another. The bells of Painted Mesa tolled just before sunrise, long and mournful, like the town was mourning something it hadn't lost yet. Eliza sat at the edge of Clayton's porch, a mug of weak coffee in her hands, watching the light spill slow and syrupy across the sand. She hadn't slept. Not really. Not since the whispers started again. It began with glances. Then it turned to avoidance. Now it was back to something sharper, looks that pierced like arrowheads, words that never landed, but always hovered just out of earshot, but close enough to bruise. Clayton didn't speak of it, but she saw the shift. When he rode into town for supplies, the shopkeeper served him last. At the saloon, folks stepped away when he entered. And in church, the pew beside him sat conspicuously empty. Then came Sunday. Eliza had stayed behind not for lack of faith, but because her presence had already stirred too many ghosts. She didn't want to wake any more. But when Clayton returned, his jaw was clenched like iron, and he didn't speak for hours. Not until supper, when the last of the light dipped below the mesa. "Eliza," he said, "you ought to hear what the Reverend said this morning." She waited. He stood up in front of the whole town and said, "Beware the woman with fire for hair, for her touch scorches not just the skin, but the soul." Clayton's voice was low, flat. He said, "The devil walks behind her shadow." Eliza felt the warmth drain from her skin. "He named me, didn't have to." Half the church turned to look at your empty pew. She swallowed. "And Talcott?" He stood and nodded like he'd written the sermon himself. "Gave a donation to the church after." Eliza stood, the coffee in her hands, forgotten. "So now I'm a witch," she said. Again. Clayton looked up at her. "They're afraid, Eliza, of things they can't explain, of what they've been told to fear. Or, maybe," she said bitterly, "they just like having someone to throw stones at." He didn't argue. By nightfall, the town was buzzing. Some said the crops would fail if she stayed. Others whispered that cattle had already begun wandering off, drawn to the red-haired ghost out on the mesa. And some more than a few muttered that Clayton Hart was bewitched, seduced by something unnatural, unable to see what the rest of them saw so clearly. The worst part wasn't the fear. It was the feeling of being rewritten, of having her name peeled away and replaced by rumor, her story stolen and retold by people who hadn't bothered to learn it. And in the stillness of the desert wind, she wondered how long even a man like Clayton could stand between her and a town thirsty for a cleansing fire. It started with smoke, thin at first, curling like a whisper against the twilight sky, then thicker, darker, billowing from the east end of town, where the widow Halston's cabin stood near the edge of the cottonwood grove. By the time the fire bell clanged, the house was half gone. No one died, by God's grace, but the flames took everything: furniture, photographs, a lifetime folded into ash. and by morning, the whispers had found their shape. It was her. Eliza heard it first from a shopkeeper's wife, as she passed through the mercantile yard. That red-haired woman's been seen walking near there at dusk. Then from 2 children skipping stones by the creek. Mama says she cursed the widow's hens last week. No one said her name. They didn't have to. When Eliza returned to the ranch, the news rode in faster than she did. Clayton stood by the barn face, shaded beneath his hat, jaw locked. She braced herself, but he didn't speak. Just watched her a little too long, like a man recounting the things he thought he knew. That night, Clara Reed came to call. She brought fresh bread, still warm and soft, and a look of practiced concern. "You poor thing," she said, placing the loaf gently on the table. "Folks are saying such awful things." Eliza eyed her warily. "And what are you saying, Clara?" Clara blinked. "Why, nothing. I did mention to Mrs. Halston once that you'd come west under a false name. I thought it was in confidence. She must have told the preacher." Eliza's breath caught. "That's a lie. I never used a false name." Clara smiled just a little. "Maybe. But people believe what they need to, don't they?" Then she leaned in, voice low and syrupy. "I warned you, Eliza. This town's got long memory and a short fuse." She left without waiting for a goodbye. Eliza stood alone in the kitchen, the smell of burning wood still thick in the air. Outside, coyotes howled at a moon that looked far too close. The fire hadn't taken her house, but it had begun to take her place in the town. And now someone she once trusted had struck the first match. The wind shifted that morning, carrying the smell of old dust and something older still, like secrets unearthed from beneath the floorboards. Eliza didn't plan to find the journal. She'd ridden out to the Talcott homestead, not for vengeance, but for air. The house sat half swallowed by prairie grass and wind-blown silence, its white paint blistered and peeling like snakeskin. It had been abandoned since Talcott's last wife took sick, though no one ever asked where she'd gone. Inside, everything was exactly as rumor had left it. Drapes still hung stiff with dust. A tea set stood untouched on the parlor table, and near the hearth, a faded rocking chair creaked gently, as if someone had only just left it. Eliza wandered through the rooms like a ghost trespassing into another ghost story. She meant to stay only a moment. But near the back, inside a small writing desk locked with rusted brass, she found it. A journal, bound in leather, so soft it looked like old skin, its clasp broken and pages yellowed and brittle with age. She sat on the floor, the journal in her lap, and began to read. June 14th. Dryden brought me tea this morning again. My cough worsens, but he insists it's nerves. I dream of drowning in fire. June 21st. He watches me sleep now. I tried to speak to the pastor, but Dryden was already there. They prayed over me. I don't think it helped. June 30th. I found the powder in the kitchen. Bitter root and belladonna. My hands shook so badly I dropped the jar. He said I must have been sleepwalking again. Page after page of a descent no one had listened to until it ended. No date. Just a final line scrawled in a trembling hand. If you find this, do not believe his smile. It burns colder than death. Eliza's throat tightened. She had no proof. Not yet. But this was more than a woman's fears. It was a warning etched in fading ink. And fate, it seemed, was not done giving her help. That same afternoon, 2 boys knocked on the door of Clayton's ranch. Barefoot, dusty, no more than 8 or 9. They carried a crumpled scrap of paper in their grimy hands. We found this behind the church, one said. Didn't mean to eavesdrop, but they were talking about you, miss. The note was unsigned, but the handwriting flourished. Practiced, belonged to Clara Reed. It spoke plainly. Eliza Byrne may not be who she says she is. Her father died a traitor. I suspect she came here for revenge, not marriage. I fear for Mr. Talcott's safety. Clayton read it twice, then handed it back to Eliza without a word. Eliza stood straighter. She called my father a traitor. That's more than gossip. That's malice. Clayton's eyes were unreadable. And now I have a journal. Proof of what Talcott did. And that letter, it won't protect Clara anymore. She went to town the next morning. Clara met her at the church steps, smiling like the winner of a game no one else knew they were playing. You shouldn't be here, Clara said softly. They're already planning to run you out. Eliza held up the journal. Clara's smile faded. And from the crowd gathering behind them, mothers, children, townsfolk with guilt in their eyes, the two boys stepped forward and said, We heard everything. She lied. This time Eliza didn't flinch. She was no longer defending her name. She was reclaiming it. Painted Mesa's summer festival shimmered under lantern light, all charm and illusion. Children raced between booths lined with boiled sweets and hand-stitched ribbons while fiddle music rose above the hum of conversation. But beneath the laughter tension simmered like heat, rising from scorched earth. Eliza moved through the crowd with purpose, the journal pressed tightly beneath her shawl, her boots crunching over dry gravel. She no longer cared who stared. Let them look. Let them whisper. She found him by the pie contest table, hands clasped behind his back, eyes scanning the crowd like a preacher surveying sin. Dryden Talcott, dressed in black, with a silver pocket watch, glinting at his chest like he'd won the evening already. He turned when he sensed her. Eliza, he said, smiling, with no warmth. Come to make peace. She held his gaze. No, I came to make truth. Around them the music faltered slightly. People noticed. Faces turned. I know what you did, she said, voice calm and steady. To your wives. To the women who trusted you. Talcott's smile twitched. I don't know what lies you've picked up, but I have her journal. Your last wife. She wrote everything. The poisons, the prayers, the fear. Eliza stepped closer. And I know why you brought me here. You thought my father told me where he buried his fortune. Talcott's eyes darkened. You lured me under the promise of marriage, but what you wanted was a map. Gasps broke from the crowd like popcorn bursting over flame. And when you saw my hair, you used their fear to reject me, tried to make me run before I could remember too much. Talcott took a step back. His hand twitched at his belt, where he usually kept a knife when not in church clothes. You think they'll believe you, he spat. A cursed girl with fire on her head. Eliza raised her chin voice, rising with the wind. I didn't bring fire to Painted Mesa. I just lit the match. This place was already full of dry kindling. Clayton stepped forward from the crowd, then silent, as a storm gathering weight. He stood beside her without a word, and one by one, others came. The two boys, the widow, even Clara, face pale, eyes wide, not with guilt but fear. For once, Painted Mesa didn't look away from the truth. And Talcott didn't smile again. The night air tasted of gun oil and dust. The crowd hadn't yet scattered when Talcott lunged quick as a desert snake hand catching Eliza's arm like a snare. She gasped, but the sound was lost in the murmur of the townsfolk, too stunned to move. A knife flashed beneath his coat. Not long, but sharp enough to matter. He pressed it just below her ribs. Walk, he muttered through gritted teeth. Smile. She did neither. Clayton's voice rang out behind them, low and steady. Let her go, Talcott. Talcott turned only enough to show the edge of his smile. I won't be strung up by a bunch of dust-eaters and backwoods preachers. She's mine. She owes me. I owe you nothing. Eliza said, her voice a blade of its own. You owe me answers, he hissed. Where's the safe? Where did your father bury it? I never knew, she spat. But even if I did, I'd let it rot in the earth before I let you touch it, eh? They were backing toward the alley now, between the mercantile and the church. The lanterns didn't reach here, only moonlight, pale and watchful. Clayton followed at a distance, hand hovering near his holster. "Talcott," he called again. "Don't make this worse. I didn't make it, Hart. This town did. You did. She did." Then, like fire snapping a branch, Talcott turned, dragging Eliza hard behind him deeper into the alley toward the stables, where a saddled horse waited half in shadow. He'd planned this, had the route ready. But he hadn't counted on her fighting back. Eliza twisted hard, ramming her elbow into his ribs. He cursed and shoved her, sending her crashing to the dirt. The knife glinted and Clayton was already there. The two men collided with a force of memory and rage. They fought like they'd both been waiting years for it. Clayton with fists and grit, Talcott with frenzy and blade. It wasn't clean. Nothing about it was. Clayton landed a blow to the jaw that snapped Talcott's head sideways, but the knife found his side, a second later, slicing through shirt and flesh. Clayton staggered. Eliza saw the blood bloom across his ribs, dark and wet. And that's when she moved. She grabbed a rusted pitchfork from the stable wall, more weight than weapon, but it swung true. The blunt wood cracked against Talcott's shoulder, knocking him off balance. He roared, turned toward her, knife raised, and Clayton drove forward, tackling him to the ground with a ragged shout. They wrestled in the dirt. The knife skittered into the dark. Eliza dropped beside Clayton as Talcott slumped unconscious beneath him, bloodied and breathless. "Clayton," she whispered, hands trembling as she pressed them to his side. "You're hurt." He winced but smiled, lopsided and full of fire. "Been worse," he murmured. "You didn't run." "I never was. The running kind," she said, voice thick with unshed tears. "Good," he said, fading slightly. "Because I think I just fell in love with you." Eliza laughed through the sting in her throat. "Took you long enough." Behind them, voices rose. Lanterns approached. The town was coming. This time not to judge, but to witness. Talcott wouldn't run again. And neither would she. The morning after the fire, Painted Mesa woke quieter than usual. Not silent from grief, but from something rarer. Reflection. Talcott was locked in the town jail, his influence shattered like glass beneath a boot. Clara had packed her things before sunrise and boarded the eastbound stage without a goodbye. And for the first time in weeks, no one crossed the street to avoid Eliza Byrne. They watched her differently now. Not with awe, not with fear. With the tentative gaze of people seeing someone fully for the first time. That evening, the spring festival resumed, tentative at first, like laughter returning to a house that had mourned too long. The lanterns were relit. Fiddles tuned. Someone poured sweet cider and passed out honey bread. And near the bonfire at the center of town, Clayton Hart limped forward, one hand pressed to the bandage at his ribs, the other tucked behind his back. Eliza, he said, his voice loud enough to hush the fiddles. "You came to Painted Mesa as an omen." Or so they said. A ripple of nervous laughter rose from the crowd. "But to me," his voice softened, "to me, you were a miracle." Eliza stood, frozen, heart thudding so loud it drowned out the wind. Clayton pulled his hand forward. In it, a ring, simple and silver, dulled slightly by age. "My mother's. I've been carrying it 20 years, waiting to find someone who burned bright enough to wear it." Gasps, soft murmurs. Even the children hushed. "I don't care what the preacher says, or what the past whispered," Clayton continued. "I only care about what I see when I look at you. And what I see is the woman I want beside me for every sunrise after this." Eliza stepped forward. Not dainty, not graceful, steady. She took the ring, and for once she let them look. As the last of the sun dipped behind the painted cliffs, Eliza lit the bonfire herself. A single spark to a pile of mesquite and pine. The flame roared to life. Her red hair caught the blaze like it had been waiting for this moment. It shimmered gold copper fire. A crown of embers glowing beneath the twilight ski-saw. The whole town turned toward her, some still wary, many unsure, but all silent. Clayton slipped an arm around her waist. "They said you'd burn us down," he whispered. Eliza smiled. "Maybe I will." But as the fire warmed the circle and laughter returned with the fiddles, they knew she hadn't brought a curse. She'd brought the kind of fire that teaches a cold town how to feel again. And that night, Painted Mesa didn't sleep in fear. It slept in peace. If you were Eliza, if you walked into a room and felt every eye shift, every whisper tighten around your back, what would you do? If the color of your hair, the shape of your face, or simply the way you carried yourself made others pull away instead of draw near, would you shrink to fit their comfort? Would you cut pieces of yourself just to be accepted? Or would you stand taller? Would you let them stare and teach them in time that different doesn't mean dangerous? So here's the question. If the world called you a curse, would you believe it? Or would you become the kind of fire that lights the way forward?